Picture this. Benjamin Franklin sits in a Philadelphia tavern in 1751, furiously scribbling pamphlets in German to convince German-speaking Pennsylvania farmers to support colonial resistance against British rule. Down the street, a Dutch Reformed minister delivers Sunday sermons in Dutch to congregants who've been speaking that language in New York for over a century. In the Louisiana Territory, French planters conduct business entirely in French, while Cherokee nations govern themselves using their own written constitution in their own language. Now imagine telling these people that someday, politicians will demand a constitutional amendment declaring English the official language of their new nation. They'd look at you like you'd lost your mind. In their world, America was designed to be multilingual from day one, and the idea of forcing linguistic conformity would have seemed as foreign as demanding religious conformity. Fast forward to today. The United States is the only major developed nation without an official language at the federal level. Not English, not Spanish, not anything. This isn't an oversight or historical accident. It's the result of a deliberate, centuries-long struggle over what it means to be American, and whether diversity is America's greatest strength or its greatest threat. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden forces that shaped our world. If you're watching this from anywhere around the globe, drop a comment below telling us what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about American identity, and reveal how a decision made in secret 250 years ago created the most linguistically diverse democracy in human history. This isn't just a story about language policy, it's a story about power, identity, and the fundamental question of whether a nation can maintain unity while embracing diversity. The battles fought over this question shaped everything from immigration policy to civil rights, from education to democracy itself. And those battles are far from over. The story begins not with the Founding Fathers debating in English, but with a shocking revelation about what language they almost chose instead. In the winter of 1794, a proposal came before the newly formed U.S. House of Representatives that would have changed the course of world history. Frederick Muhlenberg, the Speaker of the House and son of German immigrants, stood to address his colleagues with what appeared to be a routine procedural motion. The issue at hand seemed mundane. German immigrants in Virginia had petitioned Congress to publish federal laws in German as well as English, arguing that they couldn't participate fully in democracy if they couldn't read the laws they were expected to follow. It seemed like a reasonable request from people who had shed blood for American independence. But Muhlenberg's response was anything but routine. Rising from his chair, he declared that the petition should be rejected, not because German translations weren't needed, but because America needed to avoid creating what he called the Tower of Babel that had destroyed other multinational empires. In a moment that historians now call the Great Language Decision, Muhlenberg cast the deciding vote against his own ethnic community. But here's what most Americans don't know. The vote was so close, reportedly decided by a single ballot, that had it gone the other way, German might have become America's co-official language alongside English, fundamentally changing the trajectory of American culture, politics, and international relations. This near miss with German official status wasn't just a quirky historical footnote. In 1794, German speakers constituted nearly one-third of Pennsylvania's population and significant minorities in several other states. They published newspapers, operated schools, conducted business, and governed local communities entirely in German. Benjamin Franklin himself had learned German and published materials in German to communicate with this crucial constituency. The German question forced the Founding Fathers to confront a fundamental issue they had carefully avoided during the Constitutional Convention. What did it mean to be American if not everyone shared the same language, religion, or cultural background? The answer they developed was revolutionary and terrifying in equal measure. America would be unified not by shared ancestry or language, but by shared political principles. This meant that anyone from anywhere speaking any language could become fully American simply by embracing democratic values and constitutional government. But this revolutionary answer contained a hidden trap that the founders didn't anticipate. If American identity was based on political principles rather than cultural characteristics, then conflicts over those principles would inevitably become conflicts over who could legitimately claim to be American. The language question was just the beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, battles over English-only policies would become proxy wars for much larger conflicts over immigration, race, class, and the fundamental meaning of American identity. The first major test came during the massive Irish immigration of the 1840s and 1850s, when over 1 million Irish Catholics fled the potato famine and fundamentally challenged Protestant America's assumptions about what kinds of people could become true Americans. The Irish spoke English, which should have made their integration straightforward. But they spoke English with different accents, different vocabularies, and different cultural references that marked them as foreign to established American communities. More troubling to Protestant Americans, they practiced Catholicism, which many considered incompatible with democratic government. The result was the rise of the Know Nothing movement, America's first major anti-immigrant political party, which argued that Catholic immigrants could never become real Americans because their loyalty was divided between the United States and the Pope in Rome. But the Know Nothings faced a crucial problem. How could they exclude Irish immigrants without violating America's founding principles of religious freedom and equal opportunity? The Irish spoke English and were Christians, even if they were the wrong kind of Christians. They couldn't be excluded on linguistic or religious grounds without undermining the constitutional principles that defined American identity. The solution was both brilliant and sinister. Instead of attacking Irish religion or language directly, Know-Nothing politicians argued that Irish immigrants were naturally suited to slavery and despotism rather than freedom and democracy. They claimed that centuries of British oppression had bred servility into the Irish character, making them incapable of independent thought and democratic participation. This argument allowed Know-Nothing politicians to oppose Irish immigration while claiming to defend American democratic values. They weren't being prejudiced against a particular ethnic group. They were protecting democracy from people who were psychologically incapable of participating in democratic government. The Irish response was to embrace American patriotism more enthusiastically than most native-born Americans, volunteering for military service in disproportionate numbers and wrapping themselves in the flag at every opportunity. When the Civil War erupted, Irish Americans enlisted at higher rates than any other ethnic group, proving their commitment to American democratic principles with their blood. This pattern, immigrant groups responding to exclusion by demonstrating hyper-patriotism, would repeat throughout American history and fundamentally shape how the language question developed. The Civil War itself created an unexpected opportunity to resolve the language question once and for all, but in a way that nobody anticipated. During the war, the Union Army discovered that it had a massive communication problem. Soldiers from different ethnic backgrounds couldn't understand each other's commands. Military units conducted operations in multiple languages depending on their ethnic composition, and battlefield coordination was often impossible due to linguistic confusion. General John C. Fremont, commanding the Western Department, proposed a radical solution. Standardize all military communications in English and require English proficiency for promotion to officer ranks. This policy was supposed to improve military effectiveness, but it had profound implications for post-war American society. Veterans returning from the war had shared experiences of military service conducted in English, creating for the first time a truly national culture that transcended ethnic and regional differences. More importantly, the military's English proficiency requirements had demonstrated that linguistic assimilation was possible without cultural genocide. Irish, German, and Scandinavian soldiers had learned English while maintaining their ethnic identities. This discovery led to what historians call the assimilation consensus, the belief that immigrants could become fully American while retaining aspects of their original cultures, as long as they learned English and embraced democratic political values. The assimilation consensus seemed to solve the tension between American diversity and American unity. Immigrants could speak their native languages at home, worship in their traditional religions, and maintain their cultural practices, but they would conduct public business in English and participate in American political institutions according to American rules. This compromise worked remarkably well for European immigrants during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Germans maintained German-language newspapers and beer gardens. Italians preserved Italian family structures and Catholic traditions. Poles created Polish fraternal organizations and Polish-language schools. But all of these groups eventually learned English and participated in American democratic institutions. However, the assimilation consensus was built on a foundation that its creators didn't fully understand. It worked for European immigrants because they were considered potentially white and potentially American, even if they weren't initially accepted as fully American. The limits of the assimilation consensus became brutally clear when America encountered non-European populations that couldn't be assimilated into whiteness, no matter how perfectly they spoke English or how enthusiastically they embraced American political values. The first test came in the territories acquired during the Spanish-American War, particularly Puerto Rico and the Philippines, where millions of Spanish and Tagalog speakers suddenly found themselves under American sovereignty. The American response revealed the racial assumptions underlying the language question. In Puerto Rico, where residents were light-skinned and had European ancestry, American administrators implemented English language education while allowing Spanish to continue in local government. Puerto Ricans were granted American citizenship and limited self-government, with the understanding that they might eventually qualify for statehood if they successfully assimilated to American norms. In the Philippines, where residents were Asian and had non-European ancestry, American administrators implemented much more coercive language policies designed to break Filipino cultural resistance to American rule. English was mandated not just for government and education, but for all public activities. Filipino languages were actively suppressed and Filipino cultural practices were discouraged or prohibited. The different treatment of Puerto Rico and the Philippines revealed that American language policy was never really about language at all. It was about race, and about determining which populations could potentially become American versus which populations would remain permanently foreign, regardless of their linguistic or cultural assimilation. This racial dimension of language policy became even more explicit during World War I, when anti-German hysteria led to systematic suppression of German language and culture throughout the United States. The Great War transformed attitudes toward linguistic diversity in ways that fundamentally altered American identity. Before 1914, ethnic communities that maintained their ancestral languages were generally viewed as colorful additions to American diversity. After 1917, maintaining non-English languages was increasingly viewed as evidence of divided loyalty and potential treason. The change was swift and dramatic. German-language newspapers were shut down or forced to print English translations of every article. German-language schools were closed or converted to English-only instruction. German music was banned from public performances. German street names were changed to English equivalents. People with German surnames anglicized their names or faced social ostracism and economic boycotts. Most remarkably, several states passed laws mandating English-only instruction in all schools, effectively outlawing education in foreign languages. These laws weren't limited to German. They prohibited instruction in any language other than English, regardless of the ethnic community involved. The Supreme Court's 1923 decision in Meyer v. Nebraska struck down these English-only education laws as violations of the 14th Amendment, but not before they had fundamentally altered American attitudes toward linguistic diversity. The court ruled that parents had the right to direct their children's education, including language instruction, but the broader cultural damage had been done. The World War I experience established the principle that in times of crisis, linguistic diversity would be treated as a security threat rather than a cultural asset. This principle would resurface during every subsequent period of international tension, from the Cold War to the War on Terror. But the most significant consequence of World War I language policies was their impact on immigration law. The Immigration Act of 1924 established national origin quotas designed to preserve what Congress called the racial composition of the United States. The law severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, while essentially prohibiting immigration from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The 1924 law was explicitly designed to prevent America from becoming more linguistically diverse. ensuring that future immigrants would come primarily from English-speaking countries or countries with languages similar to English. For the first time in American history, language diversity was officially treated as a threat to national security, rather than a source of national strength. The immigration restrictions worked exactly as intended. Between 1924 and 1965, America became dramatically more linguistically homogeneous. European ethnic communities that had maintained ancestral languages for generations began switching to English only. Children who grew up speaking Italian, Polish, or Yiddish at home increasingly spoke only English to their own children. By 1960, America was closer to linguistic uniformity than at any point in its history. Over 90% of American children were educated entirely in English. Foreign language newspapers had largely disappeared. Ethnic neighborhoods were being destroyed by urban renewal programs designed to eliminate foreign influences from American cities. It seemed like the language question had finally been resolved in favor of English monolingualism. But this apparent victory for English-only policies was about to be completely overturned by a legal decision that nobody saw coming. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was designed to address racial discrimination against African Americans, particularly in the South. The law's architects focused on eliminating barriers to Black political participation and economic opportunity. Language policy was not on their agenda, and most civil rights leaders assumed that language discrimination was a minor issue compared to racial segregation and economic inequality. But the law's broad prohibition against discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin contained language that would have profound implications for linguistic minorities. When combined with the Immigration Act of 1965, which eliminated national origin quotas and reopened America to immigration from non-European countries, the Civil Rights Act created a legal framework that fundamentally transformed American language policy. The key case was Lau v. Nichols, decided by the Supreme Court in 1974. Chinese American students in San Francisco argued that they were being denied equal educational opportunity because they received instruction only in English, which they couldn't understand. The school district argued that all students received identical treatment, English language instruction, so there was no discrimination. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected the school district's argument, ruling that identical treatment could constitute discrimination if it had unequal effects. There is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum, Justice William O. Douglas wrote for the court. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. The Lau decision didn't require bilingual education specifically, but it established that English-only policies could violate the Civil Rights Act if they prevented linguistic minorities from accessing public services. This principle was quickly extended beyond education to voting, healthcare, courts, and other government services. The practical implications were staggering. School districts with significant numbers of non-English speakers were required to provide instruction in students' native languages until they developed English proficiency. Hospitals were required to provide interpreters for non-English speaking patients. Courts were required to provide translation services for defendants and witnesses who didn't speak English. Election officials were required to provide ballots and voting materials in multiple languages. For the first time since the colonial period, the federal government was actively promoting linguistic diversity rather than merely tolerating it. America was becoming officially multilingual, not by design but by judicial interpretation of civil rights law. The backlash was swift and politically devastating. Politicians who had never previously cared about language policy suddenly discovered that English-only policies were popular with voters who felt that America was changing too rapidly and in directions they didn't understand or support. The modern English-only movement emerged from this backlash, led by organizations like U.S. English and Pro-English that argued bilingual services were dividing America along linguistic lines and preventing immigrant assimilation. These groups pushed for constitutional amendments, declaring English the official language of the United States, and for laws eliminating bilingual government services. But the English-only movement faced the same fundamental problem: that had confronted language restrictionists throughout American history. How to promote linguistic uniformity without violating America's founding principles of individual liberty and equal treatment under law. The solution was to frame English-only policies not as discrimination against linguistic minorities, but as promotion of national unity and immigrant opportunity. English-only advocates argued that bilingual services actually harmed immigrants by reducing their incentives to learn English, which was necessary for economic and social advancement in American society. This argument was both politically clever and historically questionable. Research consistently showed that immigrants learned English faster in the late 20th century than their predecessors had in earlier periods, and that bilingual services actually facilitated rather than hindered English acquisition by providing transitional support during the learning process. But the empirical evidence mattered less than the political symbolism. For many Americans, the language question had become a proxy for broader anxieties about cultural change, economic competition, and national identity in an increasingly globalized world. The proxy nature of language politics became clear during the immigration debates of the 1990s and 2000s, when English-only policies were consistently linked to broader anti-immigration initiatives. Politicians who supported English-only laws also supported border militarization, employer sanctions, and deportation policies, while politicians who opposed English-only laws also supported comprehensive immigration reform and pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. This political alignment revealed that the language question was never really about language efficiency or educational effectiveness. It was about fundamental disagreements over what kind of country America should be and what kinds of people should be considered legitimately American. The intensity of these disagreements reached a new peak during the early 21st century, when demographic changes made linguistic diversity a permanent feature of American life rather than a temporary challenge that would resolve itself through assimilation. By 2020, over 35 million Americans spoke Spanish at home, making Spanish the de facto second language of the United States. Over 3 million Americans spoke Chinese dialects, over 2 million spoke Tagalog, and millions more spoke Arabic, Vietnamese, Korean, Russian, and dozens of other languages. Unlike previous generations of immigrants, many of these linguistic minorities maintained their ancestral languages across multiple generations, while also becoming fluent in English. This persistence of linguistic diversity challenged both the assimilation assumptions of English-only advocates and the transitional assumptions of bilingual education supporters. America was becoming not a melting pot that eliminated differences or a salad bowl that maintained separate ethnic communities, but something unprecedented in world history. A stable multilingual democracy where citizens could participate fully in national life while maintaining diverse linguistic and cultural identities. The implications of this development extend far beyond language policy into fundamental questions about democracy, citizenship, and national identity in the 21st century. Modern America's linguistic diversity is unprecedented in scale and stability. Most historical examples of multilingual societies have been either empires that imposed unity through force or temporary arrangements that eventually resolved into linguistic uniformity or political fragmentation. The United States appears to be creating something new, a voluntary multilingual democracy that maintains unity through shared political institutions rather than shared cultural characteristics. This experiment has profound implications for democratic theory. Classical political theory assumed that democracy required cultural homogeneity to ensure that citizens could communicate effectively and share common values. The American experience suggests that democracy can actually benefit from cultural diversity if political institutions are designed to accommodate difference rather than eliminate it. But the experiment also creates new challenges that most Americans are only beginning to understand. How do you maintain democratic accountability when citizens receive information in dozens of different languages from sources with different editorial standards and political perspectives? How do you build social solidarity when people's daily experiences are shaped by different cultural frameworks and linguistic communities? How do you ensure equal representation when different groups have different levels of English proficiency and therefore different abilities to participate in political processes conducted primarily in English? These challenges don't have obvious solutions, and different American communities are experimenting with different approaches. Some cities have embraced official multilingualism, providing government services in multiple languages and encouraging cultural diversity as an economic and social asset. Other communities have passed English-only ordinances and eliminated multilingual services in an attempt to encourage faster assimilation and reduce public costs. The federal government has avoided taking a clear position on these questions, maintaining the ambiguous approach to language policy that has characterized American governance since the founding period. This ambiguity is both America's greatest strength and its greatest weakness in managing linguistic diversity. The strength is that ambiguity allows different communities to develop different solutions based on their specific circumstances and preferences. Rural communities with little linguistic diversity can operate primarily in English without discriminating against linguistic minorities, while urban communities with significant diversity can provide multilingual services without imposing unnecessary burdens on English speakers. The weakness is that ambiguity creates uncertainty about rights and responsibilities that makes long-term planning difficult for individuals, businesses, and government agencies. Immigrants don't know what level of English proficiency will be required for citizenship or employment. Businesses don't know what language obligations they have toward customers and employees. Government agencies don't know when they are required to provide multilingual services and when English-only policies are acceptable. This uncertainty is compounded by the fact that language policy is made primarily through administrative regulations and court decisions rather than democratic legislation. Most Americans have never had the opportunity to vote directly on language policy, even though language questions affect every aspect of public life from education to healthcare to political participation. The disconnect between the importance of language policy and the lack of democratic input into language policy decisions reflects a broader problem in American governance. The gap between constitutional principles and administrative practice in managing a diverse society. The Constitution guarantees equal protection under law and prohibits discrimination based on national origin, but it doesn't specify what these guarantees mean for linguistic minorities. The Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination but doesn't define what constitutes linguistic discrimination versus legitimate language requirements. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodations but doesn't clarify whether language barriers constitute disabilities requiring accommodation. These gaps in legal clarity have been filled by bureaucratic interpretations that often lack democratic legitimacy and popular understanding. Federal agencies issue guidance documents that require state and local governments to provide specific language services, but these requirements are often unknown to the general public and are implemented inconsistently across different jurisdictions. The result is a system where language policy is made by judges, bureaucrats, and administrators rather than by elected representatives accountable to voters. This system may produce more consistent protection for linguistic minorities, but it also reduces democratic accountability and popular input into decisions that fundamentally shape American society. The tension between protecting minority rights and maintaining democratic accountability is not unique to language policy, but it's particularly acute in this area because language affects so many aspects of daily life, and because language barriers can prevent affected communities from participating effectively in political processes. Resolving this tension will require more explicit democratic engagement with language questions than America has ever attempted. Instead of allowing language policy to develop through administrative interpretation and judicial decision, Americans may need to have direct constitutional conversations about what kind of multilingual democracy they want to create. This conversation is already beginning in some American communities, where citizens are debating questions that previous generations avoided. Should America adopt an official language? And if so, what should that language policy achieve? Should government provide multilingual services, and if so, in which languages and under what circumstances? Should English proficiency be required for citizenship, employment, or political participation? And if so, what level of proficiency should be required? These questions don't have obvious answers, and different communities may reach different conclusions based on their values, demographics, and practical circumstances. But asking the questions directly is healthier than allowing policy to develop through indirect means that avoid democratic input and popular accountability. The international context adds urgency to these domestic conversations. America's approach to linguistic diversity is being watched closely by other democratic societies facing similar challenges from immigration and globalization. If America succeeds in creating a stable multilingual democracy, it could provide a model for other diverse societies struggling with similar questions. If America fails to manage linguistic diversity effectively, it could demonstrate the limits of democratic governance in multicultural societies. The stakes couldn't be higher. The language question is ultimately about whether democracy can accommodate diversity without sacrificing unity, and whether diverse societies can maintain social solidarity without imposing cultural conformity. America's answer to these questions will shape not just American society, but the future of democratic governance in an increasingly diverse world. The country that pioneered democratic revolution in the 18th century and democratic expansion in the 19th century may need to pioneer democratic multiculturalism in the 21st century. But this pioneering work cannot be accomplished through administrative regulations or judicial interpretations alone. It requires explicit democratic engagement with the values, trade-offs, and practical arrangements necessary to make multilingual democracy work. The absence of an official language in America is not an oversight waiting to be corrected. It's an ongoing experiment in democratic governance that reflects deeper questions about American identity and democratic possibility. Understanding this experiment requires recognizing that language policy is never really about language alone. It's about power, inclusion, and the fundamental question of what it means to be part of a democratic society. Professor Archive will continue exploring the hidden forces that shaped our world, but this particular story is still unfolding. Each of us, through our daily choices about how to communicate across linguistic differences and how to participate in democratic institutions, becomes an author of whether America's multilingual democracy experiment succeeds or fails. Before you go, remember to subscribe to Professor Archive if this exploration of America's unique approach to language policy opened your eyes to connections you hadn't considered before. Drop a comment below, letting us know what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and share your thoughts. Do you think America should adopt an official language? How do multilingual communities in your area handle language differences? What can America's history teach other diverse societies about managing linguistic diversity democratically? The story of why America has no national language reveals much about American democracy, but it also poses questions that every diverse society must answer. Can unity and diversity coexist? Can democracy function across linguistic differences? Can societies maintain solidarity while embracing difference? America's ongoing experiment suggests these questions don't have permanent answers. They require constant democratic engagement and renewed commitment to both inclusion and unity.